After Romulus, Augustulus, and Julius Nepot passed from the historical arena, the Western Roman Empire, at least in the minds of its citizens, did not cease to exist. The institutions of power created over the centuries of its development have not gone anywhere, becoming to serve the new masters. The way of life has not changed much either. In fact, of course, the once unified territory was now divided between several barbarian kingdoms. But formally, these territories did not cease to be an empire. The power of the conquerors rested solely on the ability to militarily hold the conquered territories. The barbarians were well aware that in the long run it would be more and more difficult to keep such a position. So they were all forced to somehow integrate the Roman component, at least for the administration of their own territories. The military component of power was provided by barbarian military units. And all this, of course, was good, but the problem of legitimacy of power did not remove, and therefore all barbarian kings fought for recognition by the new Rome, Constantinople. Why did they need it? Because this recognition, without committing to anything concrete, allowed them to justify before the Roman population, as well as before neighboring kings, their own right to own lands. In fact, the game of federates, started by Rome a long time ago, did not lose its relevance at the new stage of history. Yes, the empire in the West lost, but it still has influence on that territory, as it is ruled by federate kings who recognize at least formally the power of Constantinople. In such a construction, everyone was in the plus. Constantinople could interfere in the affairs of the West. Simply by the fact of favor or disfavor to this or that ruler, the barbarian kings received the legitimization they needed from the hands of the empire's authorities. Did they feel themselves viceroys of the empire? Probably not. Did they want to pursue an independent policy from Constantinople? Definitely yes. Did they feel they were part of the empire? Also, yes. It was not for nothing that the barbarians were so eager to enter its borders. Nevertheless, they all wanted to become part of the empire solely on their own terms. It is following the above logic warlord Odoacer, who seized power in Italy in 476, and will start a chain of events that will lead to the rise of our hero. The self-appointed king of Italy justified his right to rule it by the fact that he had the title of Magister Militum, given to him by the penultimate legitimate Western emperor Julius Nepot, to suppress the rebellion of another Magister Militum, Flavius Orestes. This title formally gave the highest military command, but not administrative power over the whole of Italy with a living emperor. And if for his barbarian allies Odoacer was a king, then for the Roman aristocracy, typical usurper. The fact that he himself was a barbarian for the Romans of that era was not unusual. The empire has known many usurpers, and for the last century many of them were Romans at best in the second generation. What to do? The sword gives birth to power, and if the army has a lot of barbarian element, it is not surprising that the barbarian could rise high in the imperial hierarchy. True barbarians, it was very conventional, as they were all Romanized, and from their wild relatives differed from an excellent understanding of the Roman world order. In general, the barbarian on the throne, if there was a problem for the Romans, then clearly unimportant, but the fact that Odoacer himself did not have any legal rights to the throne for the Italian aristocracy was a much more important reason for discontent. The sword can and gives birth to power. But in modern conditions, first of all, for Romans, power gave birth to the recognition of the emperors of the East. That is why Odoacer all his life tried to get from Constantinople to recognize himself at least viceroy in Italy, constantly feeling the precariousness and temporariness of his position. The methods by which Odoacer inclined the Eastern Empire to satisfy his ambitions were typical for the era: flattery, threats of violence, and their realization. Even the already purely formal deposition of Julius Nepot and the transfer of his imperial insignia to Constantinople, which made the east and west of the empire united again, was accompanied by Odoacer's seizure of Dalmatia, which was under the protection of Constantinople. Odoacer first demonstrated strength to the Romans, then made a gift and an offer he felt could not be refused. The Romans accepted the gift, the offer ignored, and Odoacer took offense. Zeno, who ruled the empire at the time, also incidentally Romanized barbarian, had completely different ideas. Odoacer was too independent and ambitious. Zeno himself also had a shaky throne because of the invasion of the king of the Goths, Theodoric Amal, as well as conspiracies within Constantinople. Choosing between solving the problem of external in the person of Odoacer and internal in the person of Theodoric, Zeno decided to get rid of both in one fell swoop. He promised Theodoric recognition as the ruler of Italy if he overthrew Odoacer. In fact, why did Zeno do it in the first place? To resolve a decade-long conflict with Theodoric. Theodoric came to the Balkans for what? To force the Romans to accept the Ostrogoths as federates and settle them on Roman soil. The 10 years that he had spent as a hostage in Constantinople as a child had instilled in him a craving for the Roman way of life and an understanding that such a way of life was far better than any independent existence in the forests of Pannonia. The problem was that Theodoric wanted to become a federate on his terms, which Zeno did not want. Therefore, the idea to send that to fight for Italy with a formal mandate to do so for the empire was a way out. If he loses, the position of Odoacer will be greatly undermined. If he wins, it will be possible through a treaty and formal obligations to try to direct Theodoric in the right direction. In general, worse than it is for Constantinople could not become certainly. For Theodoric it was a proposal that can happen once in a lifetime. After all, Zeno offered a deal, the result of which Theodoric could become not just another federate and quite an independent figure on the Roman chessboard. So the Goth agreed, quite aware that it could be a one-way trip. And so after a successful military campaign, Theodoric slew Odoacer at a reconciliation feast and became the de facto ruler of Italy. Like his predecessor, Theodoric had only a formally legitimate reason to rule Italy. He, too, was only a magister militum, but appointed by Constantinople. This status at first quite suited the Roman aristocracy, as there were no questions to the legitimacy of the power of Constantinople. Moreover, except for the direct allies of Odoacer, repressions did not affect anyone else. Theodoric, realizing that the support of the Roman aristocracy is important for the further retention of power, did not change anything, keeping all the old imperial structures. In them, as before, were appointed by the Romans, only the ruler was changed. At the same time, Theodoric very competently solved the problem of resettlement of his tribesmen. Together with Theodoric, 40,000 Ostgoths came to Italy. All of them had to be settled so as not to create reasons for revolt among the Romans. The king of the Ostgoths, correctly realizing how to act, used standard Roman practice. A special resettlement commission was set up from the Romans to settle the matter. From the point of view of an ordinary Roman, it was not the barbarians divided the land, but the Romans themselves allocated land for their new defenders. Plus, such a decision was a fat hint to republican traditions, which the Romans respected. The main source of the land fund came from lands taken from Odoacer's supporters, public lands, lands from imperial holdings, and a small portion of cut-offs from Roman landowners. The bulk of the Goths were settled in northern Italy, around the capital Ravenna and on the main routes of the likely invasion of central Italy. As a result of nearly a decade of activity, the commission was able to settle all the Goths, hurting the interests of a minimal number of people. Since now the Goths and other barbarians who joined Theodoric were the basis of the army, Romans were not taken into the army. To ensure its functioning, the entire Roman population was taxed from the land. The Goths themselves, as a serving class, were exempt from any taxes. At the same time, Theodoric not only preserved the Roman law for all Romans, thus confirming all existing rights to land and ensuring the loyalty of large landowners, but also extended it to other Italian barbarians. Thus Theodoric wisely did not deliberately separate the barbarians from the Romans, as was the case, for example, in the kingdom of Vandal. Barbarians, though settled relatively compactly, but next to them always lived Romans. They had a common economic activity, common laws, and gradually Goths Romanized. At barbarian elites also rather quickly will be found out commonality of interests with elites Roman, as in general they all wanted the same. Even with the church, Theodoric had good relations, despite the fact that the Goths were Arian, and the Pope was a supporter of the Nicene faith. Nevertheless, Theodoric declared religious tolerance and the principle of "we do not meddle with our faith with you, you do not meddle with us." Theodoric pursued an imperial policy for all of these groups, as well as for the ordinary farmers and the urban plebs. It was under him that city building was resumed. Everything that any emperor should do was done, and Theodoric himself in every way showed that he was here as a ruler purely imperial. To conquer Italy went Constantinople patrician and magister militum Theodoric. Having finished the conquest, he accepted only the title Rex, which denoted his authority over the barbarians, but not over the Romans. For this, Theodoric needed the recognition of the East, which again became the subject of bargaining and demands for mutual concessions. Constantinople quite easily recognized the barbarian royal status of Theodoric, but for official recognition as Viceroy of the West would require long 13 years of mutual flattery, threats, and violence. But all this time Theodoric will everywhere and always emphasize that he is a protégé of Constantinople, a servant of the empire. For the common people, all this was expressed in two specific things. The first is coins, where on the obverse will be the image of the emperor, and on the reverse of Theodoric himself. The second is the acceptance of Theodoric's cognomen Flavius, thereby inscribing itself in the imperial dynasty and the title princeps. Not encroaching on imperial status, Theodoric showed Romans that it not less than the second person in empire. Of course, this irritated Constantinople, as Theodoric was an extremely uncontrollable character. But it's worth realizing that Constantinople essentially had no choice but to interact with him, especially when Theodoric put the Romans before the fact that his mission was to unite the entire Germano-Roman West. Theodoric decided to accomplish what Alaric had once failed to do, unite the West on a new basis. Since chunks of the empire were now ruled by Germanic-speaking tribes, Theodoric began to subjugate them one by force and dynastic marriages. By masterful maneuvering, he was able to create a union with the kingdom of the West Goths, subjugate the kingdom of the Vandals, Francia, and the tribes of the Belgae to his will. Theodoric managed to gather under his authority all the fragments of the Western Empire, while constantly reminding Constantinople that all this is for the good of the empire, that it is better to let him gather together the fragments of the West than anyone else. But in Constantinople, complacency, Theodoric did not share, quite reasonably fearing that the appetites of the barbarian may not stop only in the West. The empire would constantly interfere in Theodoric's affairs. Imperial diplomats would exploit any conflict between the king of Italy and his subject peoples, support conspiracies within Theodoric's inner circle, and use any mistake he made to apply pressure. Theodoric was angry, quarreled with the emperor, but did not tear with the empire, even though his power had long been legitimate in its own right, simply due to his successes. Why? Because that power was weak by nature. The entire empire of Theodoric held solely on him. It was his character, his authority allowed that fragile structure that he united not to collapse. To this German-Roman Empire continued to exist, it was necessary to transfer power to the same strong heir, but he was in sight and was not for a long time. Already at the end of his life, Theodoric will appoint his grandson Adelaric as heir, hoping that he will have time to enter the power while his grandfather is still alive. He would not. But in this case, Theodoric wanted that behind the claims of his grandson were not only the achievements of his grandfather, but also the recognition of Constantinople. But even this he did not get, as in Constantinople well saw the game Theodoric and preferred to go on aggravation that on concessions went Goths. Theodoric dies without solving the problems of transfer of power. Only a few months will pass and the phantom of the Western Roman Empire created by the great Goth will collapse. Even the kindred Visigoths will prefer to get off the stormy Ostgothic ship. The new king will be forced not to demand but to ask for recognition from Rome in order to retain power at least over Italy. And at this time Roman diplomats will already perch other fragments of the empire in the hope of getting new strings to pull. The logic of divide and conquer has never ceased to be the basis of Roman diplomacy. The status quo, where all tribes living on the former territory of the Western Roman Empire accepted the formal status of parts of the empire, and Constantinople continued to pretend that it was so as long as it suited everyone. The Empire of the East was concentrating so that Justinian would have a chance to reclaim what was rightfully the empire's.